Good afternoon. Welcome to session 5. The British government claims disability is a priority issue within its international aid programme and integral to the delivery of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but it does not apply this principle to its overseas territories. This session explores the overall conference theme of how can government get it right. Here to explore this further is Craig Brewin, who is Head of Campaigns at Montserrat Association for Persons with Disabilities. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation, but before we begin, I have some short housekeeping announcements and I'd be grateful for your attention just for a few minutes. Please mute your mobile phone. Bathrooms are located on this floor. For the accessible bathroom, please turn left when you exit this room and then left again at the end of the corridor. For other bathrooms, please turn right when you exit this room and they are beside the lifts. In the unlikely event of an emergency situation occurring, please follow the instructions of our venue staff, who will direct you to the nearest exit and safe assembly point. Please also follow any instructions given by our automated PA announcement, should it be activated. For wheelchair users, ICC staff will direct you to the nearest fire evacuation lift, and another member of the ICC team will be there to accompany you in the lift and out to the nearest safe assembly point. On each level, there are 2 refuge points, one on each end of the corridor, along with evac chairs, which our staff are trained in for the case of an emergency. I'll now hand you over to Craig to deliver the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm hoping the outcome of this is that you tell this story. I think that's what I'm looking for, because it's a very, very interesting story. When you, if at the first session this morning, when they were talking about almost universal coverage of the UN Convention, there's no coverage of the UN Convention in most of the British territories, 14 British overseas territories. They're not covered by the Convention. There is no intention by the British government that they do, for various reasons, and there are quite serious implications to that. So I'm going to start with some music. This is my friend Iceman. He is the Vice President of Montserrat Association for Persons with Disabilities. The President is my partner, who is also blind. They are both blind, and I'm the human guide to the President, and I'm an advocate for the Vice President. He is 3 times Montserrat Soca Monarch. Soca Monarch is hugely important in Montserrat. The most famous one ever is a guy called Arrow, who wrote the song Hot Hot Hot, which is our unofficial national anthem over in Montserrat. He lost his job because he lost his eyesight. Diabetes is a huge problem in the Caribbean, and in Montserrat in particular. Something like 66% of hospital admissions are due to diabetes or hypertension. There's a real dietary problem in the Caribbean, and in Montserrat in particular, where we've had our natural disasters, the population has declined, and it tends to be the more unhealthy people who have remained. So Iceman lost his eyesight quite recently as a result of diabetes, and he lost his job. He worked for the government, so the government dismissed him because they can, under Montserratian law. There's no protection for disabled people in the Constitution, there's no disability legislation, and there is a clause in the general orders which the government operates under, which allows the government to dismiss people who become infirm, and he was deemed to be infirm. British territory, under British law, he was dismissed. So what he now does is he sings about it.
I'm fundamental rights, shut away from me. I don't want to say that. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. Human rights Article 33, still no sign of solidarity. I never pushed my rights, never sold my country for rights. I keep going. and I can work. I'll serve this country with pride and dignity, including art and culture. I wanna work to be my own house, but who will make a turn while I'm here? I continue to flee. Why am I? Why am I?
And it goes on. But Calypso is a huge thing in the Caribbean, as you can imagine. Calypso is a political art form. So most Calypso songs you find are political. And he was doing those sort of songs before he lost his eyesight. Now he's made them slightly more personal. But there is a history about why the British Overseas Territories are in the position they're in. This is them. The sun still never sets on the British Empire. It's just lots of small islands that most people don't know of. And ours, Montserrat, is over there on the left. And it looks like that. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited, to be honest. I'm getting emotional. But it only has a population of 4,500 people. We call it the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. And that's partly because the slave owners were Irish. They moved there from the Caribbean islands. And most of the island has got Irish names, Cork Hill, Kinsale and places like that. Most of the people who live there have Irish surnames because they're named after the estates their ancestors worked on. But that's what it looks like. And so it's the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean because it looks like that, as well as because of the Irish heritage. And the Irish heritage is celebrated. It's quite funny. It's actually quite funny. Now I'm not there, it seems quite strange. When you're there, this all seems perfectly normal. And I'm not sure there's actually any Irish DNA in people who live on the island these days. But certainly the culture is quite bright. Montserrat is the only place in the world, other than Ireland, that has St Patrick's Day as a public holiday. And it's our main tourist season. And I think it's about 2/3 of all visitors to Montserrat come for St Patrick's. So, and the Guinness flows, so do come. Now the history of Montserrat, I'll have to show you some photos to explain how we got to where we are. The history of Montserrat is that, that's the view from my house. But not the volcano. The volcano went off about 25 years ago and destroyed 2/3 of the island. Soufrière Hills. This is what it looks like about 10 years later. This is when the dome collapsed. You can see the people live here. 4,500 people live here. You can see the houses. Most people lived under that smoke pit, and those houses were all destroyed. I mentioned Arrow earlier. This is Arrow's mansion. As well as being a musician, Arrow also ran a clothing store, and that was before the volcano, and that is after the volcano. So we lost our capital. And we're starting to rebuild, and that is actually, that picture's a bit old now. Most of that has now disappeared as the volcanic ash starts to pile up. So the whole island is being rebuilt, and this is the new housing in the north of the island. 2/3 of the south has gone. We've got 1/3 in the north. Relatively new housing, as you can see, hurricane proof, concrete, brick, far better housing than there was before, but not the jobs. And not the hospital. That is an old primary school, which is now the hospital. It's a 30-bed hospital. It's being rebuilt. The whole island is being rebuilt. And that's the new hospital, which is going to be constructed over the next 5 years. That's the initial design. The architects are currently working that one up. And the loss of the port, with the loss of Plymouth, the capital, we lost the port. So we had a temporary new port put in, where the ferry comes in. And that is being replaced with this, which has been funded by the Caribbean Development Bank. So as you can see, over the past 25 years, the island has been slowly being rebuilt, but the focus has been on construction, not the social development that you actually need. And there is a reason for that, and I'll go off the pictures now and do some more serious stuff. There's a reason for that, and that's these two policies. The policy on the left is the 2012 White Paper, which governs the relationship between the UK and its overseas territories. And the document on the right is the FCDO's Disability and Inclusion Strategy, which it published this year. And there are two separate documents saying two separate things, and it's the one on the left that applies to Montserrat and the other overseas territories, not the one on the right. The one on the right is a human rights-based approach towards disability embedded into the FCDO's international aid programme, The one on the left is 10 years old now, came out just after the UN Convention was passed, but it's not reflected in there. So on the one on the left, disability is not seen as a human rights issue. And it specifically says that the UK government will not intervene on disability issues because they only do human rights issues. And until Montserrat is compliant with the convention, the UK will not apply the convention to it. It's a very, very strange position, and I've discussed this with various senior people within the FCDO, and they always say to me, oh, that's well above our pay grade. We cannot shift that 2012 position because it's embedded basically in the Constitution. The government said, the British government says it has devolved everything it possibly can and retains certain strategic activities, defence, police, judiciary. But that document says that disability is a welfare issue, therefore it's devolved. It makes reference to the DWP rather than the FCDO. So that strategy, which is very good on the right, does not apply to the territories covered by the one on the left, which is the British Overseas Territories, which is why we have no legislation, no constitution. Somebody in Turks and Caicos Islands, another British Overseas Territory, told me that although they can build parking spaces for people who need them, disabled parking spaces for people who need them, there is no legislation that actually prevents anybody from parking in them. And so you've got that rather ridiculous situation. So that explains, in a summary really, the 2012 said the UK is responsible for the human rights of persons of human rights relating to the international treaties that have been extended to them. If the UK has not extended the convention, they're not interested in the human rights. So the Children's Convention has been rolled out to the overseas territories, but the disability one hasn't. So UNICEF monitored children's issues on the islands, but the UN does not monitor disability issues either. But on the latest document, from which the overseas territories are excluded, they said they would encourage countries to put in place policies, practice, legislation, and accountability frameworks. But that's for non-British territories. It is quite a bizarre position where the British territories come last. So why? Why is the British government? It is difficult. It's a difficult issue because you've got so many British overseas territories. If you change the constitutional relationship, it is a difficult negotiation. But the white paper says they've devolved everything they can, and that includes disability. But this agency on the right, the Ireland Rights Initiative, they produced some evidence for the Foreign Affairs Committee, who were looking at this a few years ago. They said, you just need to roll out all the conventions. There's no excuse for not rolling out all the conventions. And somebody from the UN said that to me as well, whether it was actually even legal to actually say that, oh, we've signed the convention, but it doesn't apply to that territory. And it is actually open to challenge. But the Ireland Rights Initiative, who are a pressure group or a think tank, they said just roll them all out, because even if you've got no legislation, even if you've got no constitutional protection, the point of these international conventions is to protect you from your government. So it actually does give somewhere for people to go to if the local government doesn't have the legislation in place. So there's two completely different approaches you can follow. But at the moment, the UK are doing the one on the left, and everybody I speak to said that's because doing anything else is too difficult. Now this document came out recently. I did a picture of the port. The port has been funded by Caribbean Development Bank, big project. Caribbean Development Bank required a social impact assessment to be done to identify what the impact of the port would be on the local community. And it's environmental as well, because we have a bat cave right next to it. And we're looking at the impact on jobs. And they said that Montserrat was riddled with discrimination against disabled people. And it's mountainous, you can see it. You know, it's very hard to get the buildings. Most of it's small, so most of the vehicles can't, the buses don't take wheelchairs. And they actually said that one of the problems of building this port is it might bring more people to the island, which is the point of it. But by bringing more people to the island, you're exposing them to a degree of discrimination that they wouldn't be used to possibly anywhere else in the world. Simply getting into a building, finding someone to take you around. And with no legislation either, there is no protection either. So that was published by the CDB, published by the government of Montserrat. It's on the government of Montserrat website, but actually there was no response to it because I don't think anybody really knew what to do. And it gets more surreal. This is a disabled toilet. This was built last year. This is not an old one. This is a modern one. That sign on the side says this is funded with EU aid. And if you know anything about EU aid has to be delivered in line with the UN Convention. But there is no guidelines, no policies, no procedures. So that was all just ignored, and somebody built that and said, hey, look, it's a disabled toilet. And it isn't. I did point out that even if you could get a wheelchair up that slope and do the left turn, when you get to the door, it opens outwards, so you have to step off it anyway. But no, that is a disabled toilet. And look, the other strange thing as well is the shower heads point to the same spot on the floor, which was a bit weird. But that is a year old. That was identified as a disabled toilet. And it is just a lack of standards. So it isn't just me talking about this. It is a big issue. And this comes from Public Services International, which is the webpage of public services, they call it, the Union of Public Services across the world. And on International Day of Persons with Disabilities, they did a big splash on Cranston John, who's the guy in the middle, Iceman, who's the guy on the left, and Noyota is the head of the Civil Service Association in Montserrat. So they have been trying to drum up some support from around the world, as I am doing today. But it is quite difficult when we're all so powerless and stuck in a constitutional position that nobody seems to know how to get out of. Now, these are two exemptions, two very frustrating things, actually. Montserrat has a labour code, which came in 2012. The labour code says disability is not a valid reason for termination of employment. It's in the Montserrat Labour Code. But there is a clause in the Labour Code that says that doesn't apply to the government, because the government is still operating under the colonial general orders. And where there's a conflict, the general orders apply. So you can dismiss people because of disability, even though the law says you can't. Frustrating thing is the British Red Cross, because I persuaded Iceman to apply for a job at the Red Cross where I used to work, and I encouraged him to apply for the job that I used to do, which was the disaster manager for the island. British Red Cross, Montserrat Red Cross is a branch of the British Red Cross. British Red Cross has a disability confidence scheme, so we thought that Iceman Jester would get an interview, and they said no, the scheme doesn't apply to Red Cross branches. British Red Cross has not extended the scheme to its branches in the overseas territories, so no, he doesn't get an interview. Although, to be honest, he used to be in the cadet force, so he would have been a good person. Now, another thing that's quite frustrating is this, the Human Rights Report, which the British government publishes every year, the FCDO publishes every year, and it demonstrates the progress that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is doing in improving human rights and democracy around the world. And there is a section in there on the overseas territories which doesn't cover disability, and there's a section in there on disability which doesn't cover the overseas territories. This document comes out every single year, and they always have that little split. And in the last one, it was talking about the work they were doing with North Korea to improve disability rights in North Korea, employment opportunities in Nigeria, support for older people elsewhere. Really, really good initiatives for employment and welfare, but it doesn't cover the overseas territories. And that's our labour code, and that is the section 4, section 4, page 40. That's the application of the code, which says who it applies to. And the workforce of Montserrat is only about 2,000 people. Population is about 4,500 now. 2,000 work. Half of those work for the government. So the labour code only actually covers 1,000 people. A lot of those are working in tourism, they're working in retail, very, very small organisations. There are no big employers. So it actually doesn't really matter what the labour code says, because I think most companies would probably be exempted on size anyway. So it would be really important that applied to the government if it did. Now that little ring, what I'm pointing at, that was magical, was the colonial regulations. That's the opening page of our general orders, which govern the way the government works. General orders go back hundreds of years. 150 years is the oldest version I can find. And they are just to make life easier, really. These are the general orders of the king. or the King's representative in the colonies, and it basically says, don't bother the King or the King's representative with these things. These are general orders. Just follow those. And they've been running for decades. There is no electronic version of our general orders. This is a typed version, and there have been some amendments since. But because it's typed, no one's had the time to sit and retype the whole thing. So 1986, this is dated, updated 1973. The oldest version I can find is about 1930. And if you just Google individual clauses, you can go back to about the 18th century. So we're working on extremely old legislation. And this explains how people are dismissed. People are dismissed because one of the clauses in the general orders, going back 150 years, says that if you become infirm before you're 55, you can withdraw your pension. You can still access your pension, but you have to demonstrate to a medical board that you are infirm and you won't get to 55. That was how it was written 150 years ago. This is in the days when the civil servants were from Europe. And yes, you could go back to England with your pension if you're 50, if you can demonstrate you're infirm. But that has now got reinterpreted over the years as being, we can dismiss you. And the medical board becomes punitive rather than benevolent. That seems to have just happened by evolution. And there are other clauses of the similar thing. There's a clause in the general orders that says women can be dismissed from the civil service if their marital duties interfere with their work. And I couldn't understand why that was there until I started going back decades and decades and decades. And it was because originally the government didn't want to give a married couple 2 pensions. So they said if your husband works for the civil service, you can't have a pensionable job. But if you've already got one at the point at which this regulation was brought in 100 years ago, it's fine, providing your marital duties don't interfere with your job. But now that is now just, you can be dismissed if you're a woman and whatever your marital duties are interfere. And there's all sorts of weird things like that. You can't leave the island without permission, but that's because people used to live on steamships, and it was the day before email, and that's still there, and that is still used. So this is the dichotomy we have. We have the 2022 Disability and Inclusion Strategy, which is very good, brand new. We have the elected government who should be in control. We could extend, or we could give control to. We could extend the convention now. We could apply the Labour Code to the government. We could introduce a policy of making reasonable adjustments. And the reason that Iceman was dismissed was because he was a driver of heavy machinery at the sewage plant, and he couldn't drive the machinery. So you could bring in reasonable adjustments, or just look at it as a common policy. Or we can carry on doing what we're doing now, which is we stick to the white paper. We give control of the civil service to the Civil Service Commission. We make it a civil service matter rather than a political one, which is what the politicians say. We could extend the convention when Montserrat is compliant and the other overseas territories, but that is problematic. And for some overseas territories like Gibraltar, Cayman Islands, they're making really good progress. But some of the others, it's too difficult without help. We can carry on with the general orders, and we can carry on using the process that Iceman was dismissed under, which is a medical boarding process, where a doctor says, yeah, no, he's infirm, he can't drive that vehicle. So the issue is, who is in charge? And one of the frustrations with getting this changed is everybody says it's not us. And I've spoken to senior officials at the FCDO, I've spoken to the governor of our island, who, bless him, did actually book Iceman to do some gigs. He couldn't get his job back, but he did pay him to perform at some of his events, civic events. I've pretty much spoken to everybody, really. In the Constitution, the civil service is the responsibility of the governor, but it's also then devolved to the deputy governor, and the governor says, well, that's an absolute devolution, so I cannot interfere in the civil service. So that takes the government out of the picture. The Premier has been on the radio, and we've been asked about this, and he has said, I do not get involved in the civil service. Civil service is not political, and these sort of issues need to be addressed by the Civil Service Commission. So everybody says not us. No, the only person who could ever change this is probably the Deputy Governor, but the Deputy Governor is not accountable to anybody because she's a civil servant. And if you start going through the general orders and pulling them apart, it would probably take about 5 years, I think, is her view. So we're left with this person. This is Elizabeth Truss, who is the Foreign Secretary. Now, this quote is from her, from this year, and this is what she said. She said that we will champion individual dignity, full rights and freedoms, without discrimination, using evidence to inform approach. We will accelerate our own and our partners' implementation of the Convention. Where it says our own, that's because there was a review by the UN Disability Committee of the application of the Convention in the UK, and it was not a good outcome from the UK. It was the longest report ever written, and they said that the UK based its overall approach internally too much on a medical model of disability and not enough on a human rights model. So the British government was heavily criticised by the UN in 2017. So I think that is a reference to the fact that they will address some of those UN criticisms. But she didn't say not the overseas territories. So I am hoping that somehow I can get the message to her that it is actually her job to address these. Now FCDO and DFID have merged. It's her job to make sure that these issues are picked up within the overseas territories. But there's one more slide, but the battery's going. I can't change the slide. Shall I try it by hand? Ah, there you go, got it. I'll do it by hand. Battery here. So, this is a horrible. I apologise for anybody who can't see very well this horrible slide, but there's only so many slides I can use. So I'll put it all on here. So what this is my way. This is the third way, which is what I would like to see the British government do. And that is just accept the status quo, but look at some of the commitments that it has actually already made. And what I did is I went through all the funding agreements with all the bodies that have funded Montserrat's development and other Caribbean islands as well. So it's mainly the EU, the FCDO, as the DFID as was, and the Caribbean Development Bank. There's also money from the World Bank and other places as well, but it's predominantly those three. Each one of those has got a funding agreement, which is a public document, which is signed by both parties, which makes commitments to persons with disabilities. So there's a business case for Montserrat, which is the top one, which talks about disability-friendly infrastructure. That was signed in 2019, 2021. We got those toilets. So people just aren't looking. They're signing these things. And they could, if they wanted to, just follow these agreements. There's no constitutional issue here. There's no argument about what's devolved to whom and who's responsible for this and whether the British government is overreaching, which you get accused of when it tries to do something around marriage equality or financial transparency. It gets accused of overreaching. But there's no overreach here because this is signed up by both parties. You could adopt the Labour Code. It's there, it's on the statute books, it's already been agreed to. You could introduce a policy of reasonable adjustments. My partner, who I said is blind, she's the head of procurement. When she started the job 5 years ago, she was given a black keyboard with black keys. And she said, I can't see that, can I have yellow keys? And they said, no, we all get black keys. And she said, well, I can't read it. And she found one in China, yellow keys and a black keyboard. And so that's £12, will you buy it for me? And they said, no, you can't. We don't buy individual keyboards for people, you buy your own. Now, when I worked in the UK, you couldn't buy your own equipment for security reasons, but she had to buy her own. It was quite bizarre, really, and that is just something that's quite minor. The building code is not law. The building code is the OECS building code. You could follow the building code. CrossQ is a standards agency for CARICOM. You could follow the standards of CrossQ. Montserrat's a member of CrossQ, as are most overseas, well, all East Caribbean states. There is there's a line in the Constitution that talks about discriminatory access to buildings, and I think it means you can't tell people they can't come in if they're a woman or for some other reason. But actually, it also means that the door has to be on a level service on both sides, have a level service on both sides as well, if you want to interpret like that. I don't think that's contentious. The 2012 White Paper does include a line that says territory governments should meet the same high standards as the UK when it comes to human rights issues, so that could be given more prominence. And we still have some EU aid, and I think the EU aid is quite explicit that it must follow the convention, so I don't think there's a problem. And what I've said to the people of the government is you need to just go through all your funding agreements and take out the bits on disability and pull them all together And that's your disability strategy. You've agreed that already. So just write it all on one piece of paper, apply it to everything, and you will make a massive, massive difference, rather than just keep taking each individual project in isolation and say, oh yeah, we don't have any disability legislation, so we don't have a framework, so we're just going to do it as it is. So I think it is a solvable problem, but it does need some commitment from somebody who actually cares. And at the moment, I get a sense talking to people, both locally and in the British government, that actually they don't really care. And if I find someone who does, like the previous government, previous governor, he does seem a little bit scared of being accused of overstepping. The same-sex marriage thing was a huge issue about 3 or 4 years ago. A lot of the Caribbean countries were really concerned that the British government were going to impose it. They kept saying they wouldn't. It's a local issue. It's devolved. But because it's such a contentious issue in the Caribbean, that's frightened a lot of people. I think a lot of things there where I think the government could push a little bit more on, they back down on. And that really is the end, really, apart from that photograph, which is the abandoned part of the and that's just to encourage you to come and visit, because it is quite remarkable. The bit on the left is where the airport used to be. And the airport survived about 3 years after the volcanic eruption. And then everyone thought we're fine, and all of a sudden there's another one, and the ash came down and covered the airport. So access to the island is quite difficult now. It's little 8-seater aircraft. And because of COVID, the ferry's not running now either, because there wasn't enough people coming to make it worthwhile. We didn't even have a St. Patrick's for the last couple of years either, so tourism is struggling. So yeah, do come along if you get a chance. 30 minutes, no, sorry, 30 kilometres from Antigua, and Antigua is 7 hours. There you go. And that is it, I think. I wasn't timing myself, but I think I'm done.
Thank you, Craig. So we have an opportunity now for some questions. Anybody in the room that wants to ask any, you can raise your hand. And if you're joining us through virtual audience, you can use the questions field. And we'll try and get through as many as possible in the short time we have left. But we've kept on good time, so we should be okay with about 10 minutes of questioning.
Well, I heard the question. It was, do I see it changing?
You see it changing. Obviously, you've done a lot of work there, but what's your optimism around it?
Well, I mean,
you said come. Is it different for tourism? For tourists with there? Or is it the same?
So no.
If you're a tourist, is it different if you're a tourist in terms of you've got a disability? You said about people going there. But do you want to have the same obstacles if you're a tourist and you've got a disability? Yeah,
well, yes, you do. And one of the things I've been trying to do with the tourism department, and they've been reluctant to do it, is just come up with an accessibility guide. Because if you know your way around, you can get around. Some of the buildings, there's some beach bars built about 10 years ago. They're all fully accessible. We have a cultural centre which was built by Sir George Martin because he used to have a studio there. And he raised money for a cultural centre with a big concert at the Albert Hall. That's fully accessible as well. So there are accessible facilities. If you know where they are, who's got an accessible bus, where the accessible shops are, where the accessible entertainment is, you can do it. But if you just turned up to Montserrat in a wheelchair on your own or with poor sight, you would really, really struggle. But they're things that are quite easy to fix. Turks and Caicos Islands has got a page on its website for visitors with disabilities, and it does actually start out by saying, we must warn you, this is not going to be easy, but if you are coming, and then it tells you where to go, what to do, and it talks about, don't assume that if you see a disabled parking spot that is reserved to you, we just thought it might be a good idea to have. One of the interesting things that's come out of the bill, I don't know if it's an act yet, I think it's still a bill, is the Nationality and Borders Bill, which has just gone through the UK Parliament, or going through. And a couple of changes have been made. One was in the original draft, and then one was added by the Lords relating to the British Overseas Territories. One relates to people who were denied British citizenship because their parents weren't married. And there was a quirk in the British Nationality Act which was fixed about 30 years ago, but not for overseas territories, whereas if your parents weren't married and your father was British, you didn't get citizenship. Now there's been some people who've been fighting on that issue for decades and finally won with a new act going through. They had an amendment made to it. There's another one, there's a group of islands in the Indian Ocean you may have heard of called the Chagosian Islands. and they're part of what is now the British Indian Ocean Territory. They were compulsorily evacuated in the 60s to make way for an American military base in Diego Garcia. And the children and now grandchildren of the people who were displaced have been arguing for years for the right to have British citizenship, which is denied them because they were born outside of Britain or British territory. And they now have won that. There's a Baroness Lister, as one of the lords who's been leading on this, managed to persuade the government. And persuading the House of Commons to do anything from the lords is incredibly difficult, but she persuaded them to give British citizenship to Chagosian grandchildren. So you can do things if you campaign, but it's a generational fight, I think. And I don't think the British government's going to shift its position because there aren't enough people. The total population of the British overseas territories is about 250,000, and they're not a priority. It's just a fact. But if people keep raising the issue and battling, eventually something will happen, because it did with the Chagosians. We don't.
The presentation is available on the website and the app and the virtual platform, and it'll be available within the next few days. And just to say thank you so much, obviously, to Craig for taking the time to come and give us an insight into his work today. And thank everybody for attending, and you can exit for your next session when you're ready.